Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Asia Society. We have a rare, almost on-time start here because we think we have quite an audience watching the webcast. So thank you to all of you who are in the room. Thank you to all of you who are watching at asiasociety.org. This is the last in this year's Asia Beyond the Headlines series, and it's a good one. I want to start, though, by just thanking all of you, wherever you're watching, particularly those of you in the room who have been with us for many of these programs and our arts and culture programs as well. We thank you for your attendance and for your support of all our programs here. It's been a great year at the Asia Society, not just here in New York, but around the world, so thank you. Tonight, as you know, we're here to take a look at the year ahead in Asia, and frankly, you can't get a better group of prognosticators than the ones we've assembled here tonight. But before we get to 2015 and the professionals, we're going to take a moment to review 2014 and one amateur's effort at prognostication. That's what this is about. I do my own Asia forecast each year, and as I wrote the other day on our blog at the website, it's only fair if you're going to do that, to do an honest assessment a year later of how that forecast looked. So we're going to do a very quick report card, and this will give you some sense maybe of some of the things we might cover tonight as well. So if we can have the first one. Yep, that was prediction number one. Maybe low-hanging fruit. I started with elections. That Modi would win in India. I said, though, that he'd win without a majority and there'd be a messy post-election situation afterwards. So technically correct, analysis not so much. I give myself a half a point. Over to Indonesia, another election. I said Joko would run. Sure, he ran. I said he'd win, quote, by the largest margin since Suharto. So again, should have just stuck with the basic fact. Half a point on that, one for the running. In Afghanistan, I predicted that, yes, peace would win. And without choosing or suggesting that I'd know who Karzai would be succeeded by, I said the election would bring about far less violence than was feared. That much was good, but again, double down on the bet here. What was the next one? Yep. Afghan National Army holds its own against the Taliban, even as foreign combat troops depart. Right now, that doesn't look so good. Over to China. And I don't know why I made these complicated, so it's in some cases a little hard to even know whether I deserve a point or not. But in China, I said poor air quality would stir unprecedented public anger. Hard to measure, being that it's China, but we think not really, so no points. And I had a very good group of judges among my colleagues at Asia Society, so it wasn't me scoring myself. I definitely get a point for the next one, though. I mean, not happy about it necessarily, but there you have it, Occupy Central. And then things kind of fall apart. Deal in Iran. Nope. And because there was a deal, then Obama and Rouhani, I had them having a big handshake at the UN. No such luck. Elevated rhetoric between Japan and China. Dangerous run-ins near the islands. Not really. Where are we next? Yes, mutual enmity towards China would bring Japan and South Korea closer. We saw all kinds of evidence, including here at the Asia Society, that was way off base. And then a kind of weird one, North Korea, end of basketball friendship tours, even Dennis Rodman tires. Kind of weird, but yes, get a point for that.
You get 3 points for that.
3 points for that, really good. I'll take them, I need them. From the world of sport, we had Japan advancing. See, when you work at the Asia Society, you get very kind of patriotic for Asian nations. That was wrong on the Japan front and certainly wrong on the U.S. front. I thought that this thing's going ahead of me now. That's all right. No points on that. And lastly, my colleague, Jonathan Landreth, he was the only one to really advise me on this, and he gave me a kind of complicated one. He's an expert in the area of the U.S.-China film industry. Growing cooperation between Hollywood and their Chinese partners would mean U.S. studios make concessions to appease censors, while censorship of Chinese cinema remains strong, and that's a yes on all fronts. So I should listen to my colleagues more often. But anyway, yeah. Okay, let's get this. We're done with that now. Good. But I'm still glutton for punishment working on the next year's one, but I hope tonight might help me inform myself a little bit better. So, to 2015 and our professionals. You have their biographies, I think, with you in the program, so I'll keep it brief. Ruchir Sharma runs emerging markets for Morgan Stanley. He's the author of Breakout Nations. Ruchir, we are delighted to have you here. I've also learned, I didn't do my research well enough, that he's a champion sprinter, which maybe isn't relevant this evening, but another great fact about Ruchir. Ian Bremmer is president of the Eurasia Group. And by the way, Ian, as we reflect on 2014 at this institution, personally anyway, one of my highlights was listening to you and Josette on the stage here. Ian is, among other things, a 24/7 prognosticator if you follow him on social media or anywhere else, and he's a great one at that. As is Josette Sheeran, president and CEO here at the Asia Society, formerly at the World Economic Forum, the World Food Program, and the U.S. government. So really, where I used to work at ABC News, that's what you call a powerhouse roundtable. So if you guys can take the stage and give them a warm welcome while they do. So we're going to make this a freewheeling discussion, and we might skate through some things pretty quickly, just primarily to leave you all time to ask your own questions, make your own predictions. But I thought I'd start with something that's fresh and right from the headlines and right from, Ian, your weekly newsletter this week. So as you all know, the price of oil is plummeting. I don't know if any of you would hazard a guess as to how far it might go in the new year, but it's interesting to look at potential winners and losers. There are already some very obvious losers, Russia being maybe foremost among them. But you said something that I thought was interesting, not just because it's in Asia, but it's not maybe as self-evident, which is you said the greatest beneficiary right now anyway, or maybe going forward as the price plunges, would be China. Can you explain that? And we'll game that out a little bit.
Sure. Well, first, thanks. I'm delighted to be back at Asia Society. This is always a wonderful place, one of the premier institutions in New York ever to speak at, very lively, and only more so with Josette and Tom here. It was so much fun to do this a few months ago, so I'm glad we're back. Not only would I say China, I would also say Xi Jinping. I think that one of the biggest question marks in the world over the next 5 to 10 years is to what extent China will be successful at this massive economic transformation that they are undertaking, a scale of which is unprecedented, especially in a short time frame. But if you ask me, are they likely to be successful and have tailwinds at least through the next year, the answer is not yes, but hell yes. And in part, that's because of this huge gift of really low energy prices. I mean, everything that China wants to accomplish and Xi Jinping wants to accomplish is made easier by low input costs. He can engage in squeezing and making more efficient the commodities-intensive state-owned enterprises without bankrupting them, right? I mean, they have sort of an easier glide. He can also, there's no question that oil prices at the pump, gas prices, diesel prices are lower right now in China than they were 6 months ago, but not lower as they are in the United States. The U.S. right now, I think 17 states as of right now, gas is under $2 a gallon. In China, that reduction's been considerably lower. China's been squeezing it. Why? I mean, they're raising gas taxes, they're raising diesel taxes. Why? Because they understand that one of their top priorities is improving air quality. One of their top priorities is more energy efficiency. They can do more of this. They can move faster because the energy prices have gone down so much. So I think that Xi Jinping is actually an enormous beneficiary
Does it
of the
mean
prices.
that they start to change, any of you, that they start in China to change? I mean, we know that they've got their plans. They put them forth a year ago. Does this, do they sort of go back to drawing boards? It's not something they usually do in China, to say, look, this is a game changer, and we need to kind of recalibrate and
They've certainly done it with their strategic petroleum reserves, which they're building at an unprecedented rate. And so they're bringing in all this oil and and putting it into their reserve facilities. And so they now have over 167 days. This will help the
In their
world
reserve.
and trying to with their reserve, and they're building it up every day and kind of warding the rest of the economy off from it. I think they don't want to get the kind of growth that's fueled by the cheap oil, given the challenges that they have with the environment and how they're trying to tackle that, and also the investment, the very serious investments that they have in alternative energy with that cheap oil coming in. The other thing I don't know, and maybe you know, is what kind of long-term contracts they've signed. We know that some of this energy is coming in over prices set last year and before that.
So I have a different take on this, if I may say so, which is the fact that a lot of people think that, and I think this is where the miscalculations happen, that this is all about a supply issue. There's a supply glut in the world, and there's a lot of oil floating out there now because of the big boom in the U.S. and the shale gas and shale oil, etc. I think people have not taken into account that how much of this oil price decline is because of a demand problem. Mm-hmm. And I think that the biggest reason that we have a demand problem today is China. So it's not as if it's not as if China is a beneficiary, but in a way China is responsible for this in terms of what's happened. So if you look at it, we did some work on this, that how much of this is demand and how much of this is supply in terms of what's happened. And we came up with an answer about 50-50, whereas I think most of the people think it's almost exclusively a supply thing. And there's a very simple way of doing this. I mean, there are many ways of cutting this, but a simple way that if you go back to the beginning of the year and you look at what were the estimates that people had for demand growth in oil this year, and what were the estimates that people had for supply growth this year, and what's transpired so far this year. And what you find is that demand growth has fallen off quite significantly, and supply growth has increased quite significantly in terms of what people were forecasting. But the increase and decrease has been equal in terms of what's happened. And Chinese oil demand. What is real oil demand in China? I think that's the really big swing factor, because last decade, China accounted for the 50% of the increase in oil demand. China accounted for that. So when the price of oil was going from $20 to $140 a barrel, 50% of the increase in demand was coming from China, right? So it was the single biggest demand shock from China. And supply was very limited at that point in time because people needed time to get the supply act together. That's how it always works in commodities. Now if you look at what's happened is the Chinese demand for oil this year, the real demand, is essentially tracking zero. And it's the first time it's ever done that. That in 2010, just to put this in perspective, the Chinese demand for oil was up 10%. And now, this year, it's zero. So to me, and this is what I think that the markets are beginning to sense in the last few days, that this is not just about supply. It's telling you that global economic activity and the global economy is quite weak just now. It's almost on the edge in terms of very weak demand. And that's what's really causing this big oil price glut. So it's hard to see how China is a beneficiary to me in a big way. I mean, it may be a beneficiary, but it's really the problem.
But couldn't it be
there.
both?
It's both.
Couldn't it be
It's
both?
really both.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
But what I don't understand, isn't the supply pretty steady between 6 months ago before the oil prices dropped 40% and now? And isn't this directed at breaking the back of American shale? I mean, this is really a price issue, and we're seeing the same amount of supply, and we're seeing very deliberate attempt to transfer who's winning in global oil markets. And I think this effort to price shale out of the market. And so the debate over whether shale needs $62 a barrel to be profitable, or some of the bigger fields can do it at $42 a barrel. And we've heard in just the past couple of days the UAE energy minister saying, we'll take it down to 40 if that's what it takes to stop the shale development. I mean, it's very directed. And you think of this, I mean, I think the biggest winner from this really is Saudi Arabia. Just think of everything that happens in this. First is they get to punish Putin, Syria, ISIS, Iran, and the biggest threat to their competitive market, which has been U.S. shale. So shale's gone from 0.5% of global markets, I guess 5 years around, to 3.7%. And that's a real disruptor that this seems to be in reaction to, no?
It could be. I mean, but I just feel that the influence of OPEC and Saudi is way exaggerated in terms of the fact that their control over this situation. We saw this in 1986. We saw this in 1998. That we sort of associate too much control with them in terms of how much they're able to control this market.
But they are offering the oil at much lower prices deliberately to the U.S. market.
No, but I don't think they have a choice because they need the money as well in terms of the fact that in terms of their budgets are very dependent on both production and price. So they need the money as well. So I know there's a lot of talk about these conspiracy theories about, like it's being done. And my belief is no, I don't think that. I think that they're basically price takers because on the upside, the same thing happened. I still remember when the price of oil broke $80 a barrel, how much talk there was that that the Saudi will produce more, they'll give they'll flood the market, etc. But none of that happened. So like the price of oil went to $140 a barrel. So how much is it that they can really control this price? I don't know.
I just want to say I don't think it's conspiracy theory. I'm just saying what they say is their intent and what they hope to achieve.
So we could spend the whole evening talking about oil prices, but I do want to ask, because Ian, you're a great numbers guy. Where's it going to bottom out?
Well, first of all, this has become a very wonky conversation all of a sudden at the beginning, which is fine.
It's a big story.
It is it's a big story, but I mean, in terms, I'm in the middle of you guys in terms of where the Saudis are or aren't. OPEC does not have the kind of influence they used to. The Saudis, the only people that are going to move in terms of energy production are conceivably the Saudis and a few Gulf friends. And if that's the case, you don't do it during an OPEC meeting when everyone is watching and everyone is aware and ready. You do it on your time, and I think that's precisely what they do. I do believe that the Saudis don't want to just see prices bottom out because they do have budgetary constraints, but they're not particularly strong constraints in the near term. And if some shale comes off the market in the interim, I think they're perfectly happy with that. There's no question that the Chinese are beneficiaries of prices going down. Of course, Ruchir, I agree completely with you with the idea that Chinese demand going down is a big part of why it's happened. But if Chinese demand had gone down and a whole bunch of stuff in the Middle East had imploded, then demand would have gone down and price would be at 120, and that'd be a problem for China. The point is, they're a massive consumer. They're consuming less, and this makes reforms easier. I think that's big, and no one's talking about it. We're talking about how the American consumer does better. We're talking about how the Venezuelans are going to blow up. I think the fact that Xi Jinping has more time for his reforms is a big deal. Where's it going to bottom out? I have no idea. But I do think
you were dodging the question.
No, I'm not. I'm not. I think that I think Ruchir is right that demand has been a bigger part of the story than the markets have focused on for the last year. As I look forward the next 6 months, I see the potential for the Republican Congress to put further sanctions on Iran as they get skeptical of the potential of a deal. I see Libyan oil coming off the markets. I certainly see the potential for more demand from the U.S. and other places because prices are relatively low. And you put all of that together, it's hard to imagine 40. Right. But I mean, whether it's 60 or 70 or 80 in this environment, psychology plays, as you know, as much a role in all of this as does the actual supply and demand.
Do you see the U.S. Congress allowing the U.S. to export crude oil?
Over the long term, sure. In the near term, no.
Since the 70s, it's been disallowed.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I mean, LNG, we're already seeing a willingness to do that on a project-by-project basis. I think that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Japan will be treated as allowed a part of that through a multilateral deal, even though it's not bilateral. So I do think there'll be flexibility there. I think on oil, it's ideological, it's difficult. Congress would make that very hard. I have a hard time seeing that passing anytime soon.
But Tom, just to make this a little less wonky, I mean, one of the reasons this is so important is because when the price of oil is a bit higher, you see a lot of innovation flourishing in all sorts of alternatives to oil. And so really one of the big losers here is the environment and all the innovation going in and the kind of investment we've seen into alternative technologies and alternative. So if this stays with us.
People are buying a lot of SUVs here again, right? I mean,
well, it depends on how long it stays. And I predict they'll probably stay low this year. I don't know for 2015.
Just to put this in perspective, which is that if you look at the price of oil over the last 100 years, let's say, right, you take a trend line. In real terms, the average price of oil over the last 100 years has been about $50, $55 a barrel. So what we are seeing now in many ways is a classic reversion to the mean, right? So which is the fact that, and we forget that in the middle of the last decade, a lot of models used to be that the price of oil goes above $30 a barrel every time the US has a recession. This used to be the standard modeling, economic modeling, till the middle of the last decade. And then we had this huge super cycle which took prices beyond that to $140 a barrel briefly in 2008. So it's something what we call the anchoring bias in wonky terms, which is that it's something which has happened recently. It's like that's what we sort of think is the sort of equilibrium price, and we keep referring to that. But just to sort of you zoom it out, take the long-term lens, what has been the average price of oil over the last 100 years of this commodity? And the average price in inflation-adjusted terms has been about $50 a barrel. And we are sort of back to where we are on that big trend line.
But you're dodging the question, too. I thought you were
So
going to
do
give
you
a
think
forecast.
it's longer term then?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so that's why I say, I think there's been a fundamental downshift in terms of the price of oil back to where it was. So my guess is that, yeah, I mean, could it bottom around 50? It could. So maybe we're in a new range now of 50 to 70 or something. Mm-hmm. Maybe and so this and this is not so surprising when you look at the long-term historical charts. Because as I mentioned to you, that in the middle of the last decade, the standard rule any economist used to have was that if the price of oil goes above $30 a barrel, it always leads to a U.S. recession.
Okay,
well, certainly we know biofuels are not profitable at under $70 a barrel, and shale also does require, at least for new exploration, at least around 65. So the implications of what you'd be saying are quite huge.
No, I'll tell you why not. Because what happens is that these are assumptions anchored.
We will get off this topic, I promise.
These are assumptions based on what's happened historically in terms of what the costs are. But here's the funny thing about these markets: that the costs go down with the price. So everyone, I was speaking to somebody about this.
Cost of producing gold, for example, goes down with the price.
Exactly. So the input costs of what goes into oil production, in terms of how much you pay people, how much you get the oil rigs for, etc. Everything goes down.
Squeeze it. Yeah.
I mean, everything goes down. So if you look at these cost curves, if you just map them, you find that they're just a function of whatever the price is. These move up and down. The Canadian oil sands, for example, there I'm told 2/3 of the input costs are energy related. So those 2/3 of those input costs are going to go down as well. So these costs are not something which are a line in the sand. They go up and down along with prices.
We talk about plastics.
No.
Talk about plastics.
We
Can we move to a whole new topic?
We've got to get to another subject. Although I think I have a prediction to make, which is actually a 2014 prediction, which is that this program is going to break our record for words per minute. It's amazing. But because Ian brought it up, I was going to wait till later, till we get to some flashpoints. But not plastics, but Iran. Okay. Right? So the president of Iran said the other day that he's committed to a deal. We keep hearing and thinking, to the extent we hear things lately, that it's hard to see it happening, especially domestically with opposition in the U.S. Congress, particularly after the midterms. As you saw, I forecast, but Ian, you also said when you were here earlier this year, you thought there'd be a deal. This is not one we have to get too wonky about. Deal in 2015? Yes, no, quickly? Yes, no, down the table here?
Well, I will just say that for those in the U.S. who want to go slow and are not comfortable with it, the situation with oil is deeply related and related to the whole sanctions issue because people will feel we'll get a better deal waiting. So I think you're seeing a bit of wind out of those sails while people see how markets shake this out and the impact. I will just say the handshake that you predicted, little did we know that it was the handshake between Obama and Castro at Nelson Mandela's funeral that would lead to, I don't know if you all heard the big news today, a different deal that we didn't expect, which is a normalizing or a plan to normalize relations with Cuba. So history happens on our way to trying to enact very organized policies.
Only 50 years late, and sadly smaller than the headlines will announce. Embargo won't come off anytime soon. Menendez and others have already made clear to Secretary Kerry privately that they are going to fight tooth and nail against this. It's huge to open up with Cuba, but it's going to be hard to open up with Cuba. I don't want to rain on this, but while I'm raining on it, Iran, I think Iran is getting tougher. If they really wanted to get it done, it wasn't going to be a 7-month extension. It would have been a 3-month extension. They didn't do that. And the view in the White House right now is, the worst possible scenario is the negotiations fall apart and the Iranians move through breakout capacity below 1 year, below 6 months, and the rest. They don't want that. One of the reasons they accept 7 months is because they are prepared as a fallback scenario to extend and pretend, kick the can down the road to the next administration. That is not what they want, but that is their baseline for what they think is actually going to happen. ISIS is the top priority for the U.S. in the region right now. It's the top priority for Iran, too. Harder to get Iran done in that environment. Hard to get Iran done when other countries are going to help erode sanctions. In part, that depends on energy price. But there's no question the Russians, the economics minister just a couple days ago said that they are ready to ink an oil for food deal with the Iranians. They say lots of things. But nonetheless, they clearly want to make this deal harder, not easier. So there was definitely an opportunity for this deal a year ago. Mm-hmm. Susan Rice was 50-50 on it. They were aligned. There was a window. I think the window has closed quite a bit. It's going to be hard to get done.
So then, game that out a little bit, because it seemed that all that flurry of events, including here at the Asia Society a little over a year ago, really, it just seemed like a pretty optimistic situation and probably informed your prediction and mine. But here we are, and even if there's not a breakdown, but if we don't continue to extend and pretend, to use your phrase, are we back on a war footing? What's, and the implications, do all those plans come out of the closet, and is that, because at some point you can't just keep kicking this can down the road.
I am concerned about, the ISIS situation as well as the increased conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It makes it hard to imagine that baseline relations are stable even if you do extend the deal. The U.S. is, I think, doing a relatively decent job fighting ISIS in Iraq, given limited interest in the U.S. to expend a lot of resources, and people on the ground that are actually prepared to work with the United States. That is not true in Syria at all. Mm-hmm. Right? There is no strategy for Syria. There are no people in Syria the Americans can work with. The Iranians are on the other side. Right. And so, over time, is it going to be more abundantly evident that the United States and Iran are actually antagonists on issues that are important? But one of the reasons why the Iran deal was plausible was because over the last few years, the Americans and the Iranians were able to single-mindedly focus in negotiations on that deal. There was no linkage, not even to ballistic missiles. There was no linkage to support for Hezbollah. There was no linkage to support for geopolitical differences and antagonisms in the region. I think it's very hard to avoid linkage as the war against ISIS persists between the Americans and the Iranians, and that will clearly complicate the potential for a deal.
Now, you said, I don't want to pick so much on I'm not sure it was in your newsletter or your piece in The Economist. I said Ian's a 24/7 prognosticator, but you said you saw in 2015 that fight against ISIS just getting tougher and tougher from a whole range of perspectives.
Yeah, well, again, from a Syria perspective, I think that the United States is able to contain ISIS in Iraq reasonably well, and it's not just the U.S., it's the UAE, it's the Saudis, it's a whole bunch, it's the Australians, the Canadians, the French, the Brits, a whole bunch of countries. I don't think there's an easy time doing that in Syria. I think there's a big difference between containing ISIS and actually defeating them. Then you're talking counterinsurgency. Mosul still has well over 1 million civilians. Lots of people are going to die as you engage in that fight. It's going to be bloody on all sides. The Americans have complicity from a lot of the countries that are supporting the U.S. That's helpful in terms of the insulating the U.S. from international criticism, but it's not going to make the headlines much easier, frankly. And then you have the Australia problem, which is that even though ISIS as an organization will become less powerful at the margins over 2015, ISIS as a brand is going to persist and will be a bigger problem. Right. And what I worry about the most with ISIS is the inability of the United States to help ourselves from overreaction. You had no one paying attention to ISIS until 2 American civilians are executed and decapitated, a horrifying thing, but then suddenly we all want to bomb. No one pays attention to Ebola until one guy with Ebola shows up in the United States, and then we're going to spend tens of billions of dollars. I hate to say it, but at some point there's going to be another significant, probably homegrown, but maybe ISIS-inspired Islamist terrorist attack in the United States. Mm-hmm. I hope we can have as much restraint in responding to that as we did following the Newtown massacre, or following any of the massacres that occur in the United States with regularity that are homegrown but right-wing wackos. When we have an Islamist wacko doing the same thing with a submachine gun, please exercise that level of restraint, because not doing that has such a fantastic negative impact on the economy in the U.S. It doesn't help people. That's
You know, I mean, ISIS is a game changer in a number of ways, and one of them is uniting countries that really didn't feel they had many shared interests foreign policy-wise. I want to say China, which feels it is connected to the ISIS problem and has some connections, especially in the West, with the ISIS problem. India, China and India, the U.S., China, India, these new type of alliances. And if you go to the Gulf, I mean, there's a fight for the soul of Islam. And it's taken quite seriously. And people don't want to lose the gains that have happened. Women in the Gulf don't want to lose the gains that have happened. I don't know if any of you saw the tweet that went viral, but the lead fighter bomber out of the UAE was a woman. And they tweeted, ISIS, you were just bombed by a woman, hope it made your day. This went viral among women throughout the Islamic world. And so you're seeing that battle for the soul of it. Unfortunately, with what we saw in Pakistan, we're also seeing a race to the bottom on horrors. Right. And I think a competition among radicals to win the hearts and minds of people. This ISIS is more connected on social media and has this strange appeal even to non-Islamic young people throughout Europe and elsewhere. And this, I think we're in a very important larger battle. It's not just about geography. It's not just about terrorist attacks, even though this is the most well-funded terrorist organization perhaps we've ever seen. And the oil, by the way, the really good benefit of the oil drop is the fact they'll have less revenues coming out of what the oil fields they control. Mm-hmm. But really a battle for capturing the hearts and minds of young people that are pouring into this area. I think we have to. I don't think we've taken this seriously enough and comprehensively enough, and I think it will play out for a long time. And I think it's formed some very serious new revival of some old relationships and new relationships, and I'm not sure we've quite figured out a comprehensive approach that we need for this.
Okay, we're going to take another slightly odd turn here, but Ruchir and Josette both had predictions, which we did talk a little bit before this program, that come back to the economy. And when I first spoke to Ruchir just a couple of weeks ago, I asked him about things he was most worried about, and it took him about 3 seconds to say credit bubble. You want to explain? And that's China, by the way.
Yeah,
now, people have been worried about a credit bubble there for a long time, but you're looking at 2015 as...
I mean, I'll tell you, what the thing here is, which is that after there's a crisis anywhere in the world, there's a lot of analysis as to what caused the crisis, and usually people come up with new reasons after every crisis as to what caused it. And I was in Asia when the East Asian financial crisis happened in 97, 98. And there was a lot of hand-wringing about what caused it back then. And then again in 2008, when the crisis happened, a lot of people then came up with reasons after the crisis to what caused it. This really sort of got me to go back and really get a research team to do a lot of work. That if you were to look at the last 100 years and try and sort of see that is there any consistent factor which is good in predicting economic crises? Because everyone comes up with new reasons after the crisis. Is there anything consistent which shows up? And luckily for us, at least one factor did show up. And it's a pretty simple thing, which is that when a country increases its debt very sharply over a short span of time, no matter what the level at which it starts, that is a very high probability that's followed by a crisis. And if not a crisis, a very sharp slowdown in economic growth. Right? So that's true, which goes back to the years preceding the Great Depression. It's true to the years preceding the Thai baht crisis and the East Asian crisis, and something true which was there in the US and Spain before the 2008 crisis. That if a country increases its debt very sharply over a short span of time, it usually ends up in some sort of trouble in the subsequent 5 years. And why does that happen? That happens because when a country sort of extends too many loans, it usually ends up making mistakes in terms of who gets those loans. And a lot of people who don't deserve to get those loans, or the credit worthiness is not there, end up getting those loans. And so that leads to troubles later on. Now, the last 5 years, which is the country which has had the biggest credit binge in emerging market history? I'm not talking about the last 10, 15 years. In the last 50 to 100 years, it's China. China's debt as a share of its economy has gone up from about 160% or so to about 240% currently. That's a rise of more than 70 percentage points, about 75 percentage points to be exact, or so. There is no other country which has seen such a large increase in its debt as a share of its economy. Now, this is a country that I used to be really optimistic on. It's a country we all believed in, about the big economic miracle, the same league as Korea, Taiwan, Japan, as far as economic miracles are concerned. But something has gone amiss in the last 5 years. And that, I think, is the fact that as the country has become a middle-income country, it's still trying to grow at a pace of a young sprinter, right? So it's still trying to sort of sprint at a pace of like 7 to 8%, even though now it's a middle-income country. And so therefore, it's relying on more and more of debt to try and sustain that economic growth rate. I mean, just to put this in perspective, that till about 2008, it took just over $1 of debt to create $1 of economic growth in China. Now it's taking nearly $4 of debt to create $1 of economic growth in China. Now, these are the kind of statistics we saw in the US as well back in 2006, 2007, and in so many other countries which ran into trouble. So therefore, for me, I'd say that the biggest risk currently is how does China handle this massive debt buildup which it has taken in the last 5 years or so.
I sense a rejoinder, Ian. Am I right or no?
Well, I'm not an economist. I mean, I certainly defer to Rashir in terms of how much it costs China to have growth, and there's no question that if you look at economies that have been at roughly this level of income over the course of the last 150 years and the kind of growth they've experienced on balance over the next 25 years, the averages have not been 7%. It's been more like 4.5, right? So you would expect there to be a rebalancing there. Having said that, China is an authoritarian political system. It is a state capitalist economy. It does not have an open banking system. So the political ability for the Chinese to continue to kick the can is more significant than that of a democracy that you can short. And so, I guess I would say I see the risk, but I suspect that to the extent that any country would be able to put it off, and that 2015 would not necessarily be the year that it would hit, and I'm not sure Russia would disagree with this, that China would be the country I would bet on there.
I think there's going to be bumps in the road, but if you look, China is a number of countries within a middle-income country, and we have 100 million people still living under $1 a day. You have the West, which still needs vast investment in infrastructure, and a lot of the waste in the investment, which was just, literally building out almost everything. If you look at it, you have to ask how overbuilt is China really? And so the amount of housing per person, for example, still about 2/5 of what the U.S. per person. So even with all this overbuilt housing, you have a gap between incomes and access and all of that and placement of the housing. But, it's our assessment in a report that we did with Dan Rosen called China's Rebalance, where we've taken all of these reforms that China is headed toward an OECD-style economy with all pretty much the elements of reforms needed to do that, and needs to slow down, and is probably going to come in for a soft landing. And the only thing I would say is if you're in China, it doesn't feel like 7%, feels a little bit more like 5%. So these numbers at any rate are a little bit lower, but it's all about the base there to me. And so China's economy has doubled in size over the past 5 years. I think that's the opportunity everyone's seeing. And I will just say the Jack Ma phenomenon, right? Where 10 years ago in China, everyone I talked to wanted to be Bill Gates. Today, everyone in America wants to be Jack Ma. And so, this reversal of fortunes, but what does Alibaba represent? It represents connectivity without arbitrage. And you're seeing now the economies of Asia connecting onto a powerful platform. So, Facebook may be the biggest platform in the world, but it's a winner in sharing family photos, not in the e-commerce connectivity. And so I think there's more strength there than is evident. And we actually don't have quite the right tools to analyze China's strength because the reporting's done in different ways than we can get access to. But I think while there may be blips, I'm
Maybe not
very
a sprinter
bullish.
anymore. Right?
Yeah.
Well, before we leave the note, Josette threw out a number in there, said maybe not 7, maybe 5%. We actually took in a whole bunch of predictions from our global network and our executive director in Mumbai, in India. She threw out a double prediction, which was that China would fall short of 7 and India would go north of 7. Ian or Ruchir, you want to jump in on either a China or an India number?
Well, first I'd say that this comparison between China and India is sort of fun to do, but means nothing because because India's per capita income or its level of development is like like a fifth or sixth of that of China, depending on how you're measuring it. So from a low base, it's much easier, as I said, to grow more quickly. So I know a lot of Indians get very excited that and they talk about how they're going to be the fastest growing economy in the world. They've been waiting for that to sort of get that title and see China sort of dethroned from that. And a lot of people are speaking about it. So, but I think that China, today is already growing at a pace, as you said, of possibly closer to 5. If you look at the real data out there, I mean, in terms of what's going on. And I think that as far as India is concerned, I think India will grow faster than China in the next couple of years. But I don't think that's a testament to like India necessarily. It's because India's base is so low, that's going to grow. And China is,
they're only behind by 25 years.
Exactly,
right?
it's going to mature. China's economy has matured, and it can't sprint that quickly. But the two are different leagues. I mean, to speak about China and India in the same breath, I think is just not right.
If I could just say also, with all the chaos that's happening in some places in the world, Asia's really, to me, the place of certainty and is emerging really as the bright star. And I just want to point to 2 leaders that I really think have been, 3 leaders that have been game changers this year. So Modi, very interesting, who, all he had to say to kind of get my attention is, we're going to take the 67 forms you have to fill out to start a business in India and try to get it into one stop on the internet. Things like that. Or, we're going to have a revolution building toilets around India. That he understands the microeconomic problem as well as the macroeconomic problems that India faces and, has a track record of tackling these. He also, he came here with a bit of swag. He said, listen, this is going to be the Asia century. We don't know if it's going to be China's or India's. And he really, has come on the scene. I thought he did the India-U.S. relationship a ton of good when he visited here and reset that dial. And he's been going around the world trying to convince investors to come in, including, going and meeting with Abe, having great meetings in Japan, but also his neighbors to the north.
Do you mind if I just jump in while you're on Modi? Because this gentleman, you may not know, said we may have a little window of disagreement here because you said to me that 2015 would be the year when great expectations meet judgment days for a couple of new leaders, and you said that would happen to Narendra Modi.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's been the pattern, which is that typically in the first year when a new leader comes to power, you get a lot of euphoria. And it's in the second year that you really get to sort of test as to whether is this person holding up to the stuff or not. So
in the U.S. too.
Yeah, a recent example, with Penn and Airtel, like in Mexico, like a different place. Everyone was gaga about him. And the second year, basically, his thing has just imploded in a way in terms of what's happening in Mexico.
That doesn't mean it has to happen.
No, but I'm saying that but in some regards, we have successful leaders who do very well in the second year as well. So it doesn't have to happen one way or the other. But I think in Modi's case, that 2015 is really going to be critical because the one thing he's done so far is he's focused very much on foreign policy. And I think that there's some disappointment that why hasn't he done any sort of really big reforms when he has the political capital in the country to do it. Now, I think it's too early to judge. But therefore, I think that at the end of February, India presents its budget. And that budget is always a very big deal in India. It's not the standard budget about the accounting system. It's about a statement in terms of that this is what we're going to do. I think that, to me, I'm really watching that in a very, very important indicator that is he willing to sort of take on some meaningful vested interest there, or is this going to be sort of twiddling the knobs here, there, and the other, and thinking that we'll be able to sail through this? So therefore, I do feel it's Judgment Day, and next year is going to be absolutely critical. And I would think that the Feb 27th, when he presents, when his finance minister presents that budget, is a date really worth watching. That because if we do not end up getting anything meaningful, then I think there will have people very disappointed. Because today the problem for us, and this is more from an investing side, and I'm always concerned when this happens, is that I cannot find a single person who has a negative thing to say about India, right? So, and I'm always concerned from a contrarian standpoint that, boy, that is that right? Because we are all heavily invested in there, and that's something which I sort of am slightly worried about. That that our expectations too high. But I want to give this a benefit of time, and I would say that's the day to watch.
So, I mean, I got to tell you, I mean, you're right that there's a lot of enthusiasm about Modi, but I mean, almost every corporate CEO I talk to says, India, great story, but we can't make any money there. The infrastructure is horrible. It's been so broken for so long. And I guess what I would say is, yes, expectations are high, but they are high compared to one of the most underperforming governments in the world for decades. And so, I mean, you talk about Josette. You were saying how excited you were just because, if it's a one-stop shop, I mean, that's something Singapore figured out decades ago. If India could do that now, that'd be a big deal. I mean, just having a party official return your call is actually so much higher than your expectations in India. I mean, having one other chief minister that acts like Modi did in Gujarat, never mind the fact that they probably now have 9. That's a big deal. So I just think, I mean, the fact is that they have been so negative. It has been so hard. Infrastructure has been so bad. Incompetence so rife. Corruption so enormous. Cabinet ministers so incompetent. Party structure so badly managed.
Well, what do you really think?
Well, I mean, no, because Rishir said no one says bad things about India. I say all sorts of bad things about India, even though I love going there, and I can't get more than 2 or 3 meetings done in a day because you can't move in the country. But never mind that. The fact is that that I think the ability of Modi to exceed the way it used to be is really high.
There we go. That's my point, right? So that everyone's on the same train.
That's true.
I mean,
Wait, can I just say on this? So moments of history align. And I'm sorry, whatever our trauma is from trying to deal with investing in India and hoping and wishing and I've got the fatal attraction. I mean, my first trip as a U.S. government official was to India. I mean, we're so similar. This is the world's biggest democracy. Everyone wants India to win,
That's
right? And the frustration, and I said after my first trip, I'll come back when you're ready, whenever that is, and it still isn't quite ready. But okay, think about this: India, the non-aligned nation, very socialist in approach, right? Now is saying, we're not non-aligned. We have an opinion here. We want to be part of the global economy. We want to function. We want a world-class infrastructure. I mean, at least that, and the support of the people saying, let's get on with some of this tough business. India wants to be part of APEC. We're not responding to this. I think it's an important moment to say, if India wants to be part of the momentum toward building well-functioning, connected trading economies, that it should be a very forward-leaning agenda by the United States and others to say, come on in. It is in the world's interest for India to succeed. And this is a real good opportunity to try to help support that.
So, I mean, we come back to where Rishir started, really, which is watch February 27th, watch the whole year, and see what happens. I will just point out one thing which I read the other day, and I may not have the numbers exactly right, but there was a Commerce Ministry statement. So governments make their own predictions, of course. And this guy in India said that India's place would rise dramatically on the standard of ease of doing business. And then the next line in the article said they're at 142 right now.
Yeah.
So to all the
But
points
just
you
the
were making,
fact
I mean,
that they're looking at the ease of doing business report, which is
Right.
the World Bank survey, I could tell which nations in Africa were going to move ahead quickly because the top presidents and prime ministers had that report on their desk, and they were asking their ministers how they were doing on indicators like numbers of days to set up a business, number of processes. And the fact that we even have officials in government talking about that report, that has never happened.
So there's so much still to cover. I got pages of notes here, and we want to come to your questions, but so maybe we'll just quickly go through a couple of things. Shall we try? One is North Korea, which is kind of always on our minds, but strangely, you've probably been following this whole business with Sony, we're now paying increased attention to North Korea because what seems to me to be a pretty, what do I know, but kind of ridiculous movie is about to come out on Christmas Day, but maybe not with ridiculous ramifications. So all the surveys, and it probably has nothing to do with the film, of global hotspots and everything else, see this ramped up. It's nearly 2 years since the North Koreans conducted nuclear tests, ICBM and all that, and a lot of people, Carnegie just put out a statement saying high likelihood that that's going to come and crisis. And jokes about movies notwithstanding, do any of you want to hazard a guess as to whether we're headed for a crisis in that sector again, or is this another impossible to predict one?
This is a great extend and pretend one. You really don't want to mess with a country like North Korea. China's had it right for a long time, which is, frankly, stability and kind of keep them where they are. One of the big mistakes the Americans have made with the Russians is push them into a corner and make Putin feel like the only choices he has is capitulate and lash out. North Korea, that's not been the way it's handled, and so as a consequence, the Hermit Kingdom has left most of us alone, with the exception of Sony. And I don't know who was advising them on geopolitical risk. I suspect nobody. That was a stupid idea, right? That was a
They're
very...
not Eurasia Group clients, right?
And they're not yet Eurasia Group clients. I saw the reports a couple hours ago. It looks like the U.S. government is now saying it was the North Korean government. It certainly has to be someone linked to them, because who the hell else would have the interest in doing this? The fact that the North Koreans possess that kind of cyber capacity, I worry about this. I worry about this not just for North Korea. I worry about this because Russia has lots of cyber capacity. They have made the direct argument that the U.S. is engaging in regime change behavior in terms of sanctions. If Putin starts to really feel besieged, are we not going to see major cyber attacks against American banks? What would it mean if a U.S. bank had its information portrayed the way that Sony's is? That's a serious issue. And so I do think the asymmetry around these kinds of attacks are becoming important. And the fact is, North Korea used to be something we really only worried about if they imploded or launched a war. Right. Now we're seeing that North Korea has asymmetric capabilities that actually do matter. You've taken over 10% off of Sony's market cap over the last week as a consequence of North Korea. That's real.
Yeah. And by the way, from the sublime to the not so sublime, so we had a tweet from somebody named Jamie Sawyer, a prediction of his or her own, I don't know who Jamie is. Kim Jong-un in 2015 will watch the new movie, The Interview, and invite James Franco and Seth Rogen to North Korea for a diplomatic visit. And I'll just go out on a limb and say, I really, with all due respect, Jamie, I don't think that's going to happen.
But I think it'll be their last trip. I mean,
right. Okay, we wanted to come back to Josette. I haven't forgotten your big prediction in the form not of 3 words, but 3 letters, TPP. Explain. What's going to happen?
Well, so the U.S. has been negotiating 2 big trade deals, both in Asia and then also with Europe. So TTIP and TPP. TPP with 12 economies, it represents about 40% of global GDP. The big question was, after that's finalized, and if we can get through the agricultural issues with Japan, which I think are moving, and Prime Minister Abe, so we have some of the diplomats from Japan here, made a statement recently saying we're going to get this done. And, frankly, I think it's viewed internally in Japan and a number of economies as a way to spur the kind of reforms that countries are trying to achieve. So I think that's in good shape. The U.S. has done the hard work to really get this going. I think it's an important deal. And I think now we see a convergence between both Obama's legacy and the United Congress under the Republicans both needing to prove they can get something done. I think we have a 10-month window to try to get this through, but I think we could see at least TPP, if not both of these, move through Congress, and a demonstration to the American people that Washington can move something. I think this, and I think it's important for a number of reasons globally.
Yeah, and I mean, how much on the Asian stage in particular, how much of a difference maker would that be if Josette's right? And she probably is right, because this is what she used to do for a living, right? I mean, TPP, for any of the places you've been talking about, I guess Japan is a very good example. But
sure. Yeah. No, I think, if this transpires, like, it'll be great, because one of the big trends in the global economy, which is playing out currently, is what we call deglobalization, which is that you end up, like, in terms of global trade in, like, isn't growing the way like it used to. Barriers, they aren't opening, and capital flows aren't moving the way they used to. So this thing of deglobalization is like the big trend, which is sort of taking hold. And if you get something which reverses that, obviously it's going to be like a real positive. But I don't have an instinct as to how much progress will be made there, which is what you know much more about. But one of the things I worry about the global economy is this trend of deglobalization, because this is something which had helped lift economic growth globally for the last 2 or 3 decades, and that trend now has reversed.
I agree. I think it's going to happen early in 2015, actually. I think it's one of the few things that the administration is actually pretty committed to. They think that they can actually make movement on it. With a Republican Congress, it doesn't actually get harder, unlike most things, for Obama. To be clear, I'm not making a political point there. And furthermore, I think if TPP is closed, I think it's the single most important foreign policy victory that Obama has in both of his terms. I think for me the most important thing when TPP was first announced, the Chinese response was, it's not going to happen and we hate it. Their response now is more, we're studying it, we're interested, do we want to try to join or not, and if so, how and when. I mean, the fact that a successful TPP with the more advanced economies in the region, plus the U.S., Mexico, Canada, actually helps to facilitate a lot of the reformers in China and their arguments for why they want to engage more towards U.S.-led standards that otherwise many of them are rejecting. I think that's an enormous positive, and so that's precisely why you want to have it.
And it was really interesting at APEC to hear President Xi's speech. I was there, and, it could have been any market-leading head of state. He talked about innovation, he talked about integration, he talked about connectiveness as being the keys. And then he pushed the free trade area of the Asia Pacific that's been under APEC, that was kind of languishing under there, that's kind of an APEC-wide idea, and really was driving that. And what's interesting in response to TPP is to say, bring everyone on board for a big free trade agreement. I think it points to the diplomatic value, the economic diplomacy value of trade beyond just the specifics of the agreement, which will be important, which is this kind of bicycle theory of trade that you have to keep moving. You have to keep moving toward openness and integration, and it creates a different kind of competition, not to close and be nationalistic and put up barriers. And we're seeing that, with even China saying, wait a minute, and then taking a step further. So just think of the initiatives China's put out there in the last month. An infrastructure development bank. I mean, for all of us who have said China has to be a responsible stakeholder and play its role, they're capitalizing that perhaps at bigger than the Asia Development Bank. They're talking about a development bank with the BRIC countries. They're talking about an Asia-wide free trade agreement. They're negotiating a bit with the United States. I mean, this is momentum to the kind of things that we've tried to push forward in the world, but also a little competition to the leadership that Europe and the U.S. have traditionally had in these areas.
That's a really good point. Did you have one more
Well,
thing?
I agree with everything that you just said there, Josette. I want to make the... No, come on, this is good stuff. But let me say something negative about China, since I've been on a pretty positive side of this story so far, which is we haven't talked much about Russia so far. And, for all of the great things that China is doing right now, in terms of building infrastructure and architecture that can be constructive, even if the U.S. views it as competitive. The China-Russia conversation is not constructive from the perspective of the global order. It is really problematic and will facilitate deglobalization in many ways. When the Chinese and the Russians are getting together and talking at the highest levels, they're talking about shared values. They're talking about their concern about Western values and the danger to political stability as a consequence. Russia was very interesting when Russia talked about China, India. He said you shouldn't really have the two countries in the same conversation because they have nothing in common. There's no point in comparing them. One could make that argument about Russia and China too, because the Russian economy is so tiny compared to that of China. China's about 10 trillion in terms of GDP, and Russia, depending on what day you look at their currency, is one. It's about one, right? It's about one. And so you say, well, wait a second. So China's massive, and so China's influence over Russia, China's ability to fund Russia, if the Americans are going to cut the Russians off, the Chinese can make that whole for them. Except the Russians are a real geopolitical power. They're a tiny economic power. Right. They're a real geopolitical power. And that is exceptionally useful as a hedge for China going forward against the United States. And the Chinese see that. And I think that of all of the trends over the past few years, the one that is absolutely the most dangerous to the global order, the most dangerous to globalization as we all see it being useful and persisting, is precisely this. Okay. Precisely this, yes.
So we're going to do one more bit of China business and then all of your questions or predictions. And that is, we haven't talked about, we haven't used the word maritime, right? And the Chinese themselves have said, quote, that 2015 will be, quote, a year of maritime cooperation with the Southeast Asian nations. Ian, you've written that you think in that area it's more bluster than conflict on that front, but I mean, there's a lot of concern either about a terrible flare-up or maybe more commonly the notion that the Chinese are just slowly but surely, without big flare-ups, creating not facts on the ground, because it's not ground, it's sea or it's rocks. And certainly the Southeast Asian countries would, and they have on this stage, quarrel with the notion that it's just a little bit of bluster and that everything's okay. Where's that on your worry scale? Maybe start with Ian and come down.
Well, long term, it's pretty high on my worry scale. I mean, China's going to be a hell of a lot larger. I mean, I saw the head of the Indian Air Force come out a couple weeks ago and basically say, look, China's over the next 20, 30 years, they're going to take over Taiwan, they're going to take over the Straits, they're going to take over Arunachal Pradesh, and we're going to have to really build our Indian military. The head of the Indian Air Force. Okay. And that's why we have to have serious building of our expansion of our military budgets. And the Chinese, of course, said that's how can you say this? I mean, the fact is, over the long term, China's rise is absolutely, they will be the dominant military power in the region, and that will clearly be a security threat to just about everybody. Mm-hmm. And some countries they will capture, some countries will be useful and able to hedge, like a Singapore, and some they will have very serious problems with. And that'll be a challenge, and where the United States is in that relationship will be very interesting for, say, Japan, for the Philippines, for even Vietnam, South Korea. But in the near term, I mean, I thought Josette, when she talked about the fact that there's real leadership in Asia right now, mm-hmm. that leadership not only is charismatic, but is focusing on domestic economic reform. The Chinese decided after Abe was begging for a meeting for months, they finally gave him one at APEC. And in part, that's because the Chinese didn't want to see Japanese investment down 46% into China year on year because they're focused on trying to keep their economy going well as opposed to nationalist bluster. Now, if Russia is right and the China story is actually worse than I think in the near term, and it starts to go very badly in terms of credit bubble and very badly in terms of growth, it's not a soft landing, it's a hard landing, or it's a crisis, well, then nationalism is going way up and China, Japan is a super problem, and so is China, India. But I don't see that in 2015. So I think in the near term, the fact that you've got Abe, you've got Xi Jinping, you've got Joko, you've got Modi, all of whom are charismatic and focused on, decent economic programs, should imply that the great power politics in that part of the world aren't as bad as they are, say, between Russia and Europe, where the potential of a military accident is exceptionally high and very dangerous.
Tom, I just have to jump in because we have 2 weeks left in 1914.
2014.
2014. And if we go back to 1914, 100 years ago, it was precisely these kind of dynamics rising new powers who felt they weren't respected and didn't have a seat at the table, and no one listened to them. You had declining older powers that felt very threatened by it, and a shift in power. And then you had the rest, who felt very threatened by these tectonic shifts in power that were happening. And if you look at a country like Vietnam that does not have security arrangements, special arrangements with the U.S., it's there, it's right on the border. It was very interesting. Now they're doing some deals with Indian military. You're seeing a rearrangement of the entire situation in Asia in ways that we have to take very seriously. Both the voices of the smaller powers who are very insecure, and there's a lot of opportunity for mishaps in all of this, and then the shifts in power between the rising and new. Now, China has two interests in the South China Sea, in addition to what Modi called in Japan, this countries that worry about 18th century issues or something like that. One is they see this as potentially a huge oil reserve and source of energy. And secondly is the trade routes, keeping the trade routes open. I don't know if any of you followed what happened November 18th in Yuli, China, about 300 kilometers south of southwest of Shanghai. But that's the biggest wholesale market in the world, small items. And China launched the first Trans-Eurasia train route there on November 18th. It goes all the way to Spain. It's the longest train in the world. And it's the reopening of the old Silk Road, and an effort, and it's the first, since about 90% of container shipments are on sea, to divert away from the straits container shipments all the way into Europe. It's a phenomenally huge shift in the way trade patterns will work. I worry that the world is not understanding these strategic shifts that are happening and the changes that are happening, and how now we see countries like China really coming online and changing the dynamics in a very deliberate way.
All right, so we got to go to the audience. I'm sorry, there's going to be a lot of questions. Let me just, some of the stuff we didn't touch on is coming in here over the, it's funny, people normally ask questions. People are just flooding our inbox with predictions. So Afghanistan's national, we didn't talk about Afghanistan, another new leader there. The National Unity Government will finally show signs of functioning like one, with President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah agreeing to disagree. We have Ben via Twitter saying there will be a deal with Iran. Relations will be upgraded. The Washington Post reporter will be released with Cuba and Alan Gross agreement as a model. Good. We haven't covered Hong Kong. I know Ian said that we should worry more about Taiwan next year than Hong Kong. Myanmar, I have a prediction of my own that Aung San Suu Kyi will get on the ballot and they'll revise the Constitution, and I think if that happens, she'll be the president. And there are 3 World Cups happening in the world next year, and I don't know much about any of them, but there's a Cricket World Cup, and I'm going to go with Ruchir and say that India is going to retain its title. Is that a retain a title? Or
yes.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yep.
I used to play rugby, but I have no idea who's going to win that. And then we have a tweet from Stephanie Futch saying Japan and the USA face off once more in the 2015 FIFA Women's World Cup. That's soccer. Okay. Yes, sir, on the aisle here. And if you can say who you are and keep it brief, that'd be great.
Henry Yan, thank you. Question about Hong Kong. With the Occupy Central or Umbrella Revolution sort of went on for 2.5 months, coming to an end. Obviously, the economic data has come out in fourth quarter. I presume that it probably doesn't look, it's not going to look pretty. What does the panelists' thoughts, both politically and economic for Hong Kong in 2015? That's number one. Number two is...
I think we got to do number one. We got so many people with their hands up, if that's okay.
Okay, then we'll say
number
number one then.
Yeah. Anybody? Hong Kong, economic, political.
I'll do political. It's an irritant for the Chinese government, but it's one that they feel like they can contain, and I happen to agree. I mean, you remember when the demonstrators came out to begin with, and they made some, fairly broad demands that if they were not given suffrage, that they were going to occupy government buildings, and the Hong Kong government thought about that, and they said, well, no, that won't work for us. But instead, how about nothing? would nothing work for you? And turns out nothing actually works, right? That's the thing. As I'm sure you've seen, Cameron said he was very concerned. Obama said he was very concerned. Ban Ki-moon expressed concern, as he always does. But no one was prepared to do anything, and it's because it's China. It's not Russia. It's not a country we think that we can kind of, sort of really bat around. It's China. And within Hong Kong, they understood they didn't have any support internationally. And over time, they didn't have very much support within Hong Kong either. Because, people at the beginning, they didn't like the fact that there was a little violence. They were using tear gas against some young kids. But, over time, as the Hong Kong government, sort of took a more restrained response to them and allowed people to realize that nothing was going to get done except for the fact that their commute was being disrupted, suddenly the opposition was more significant. And then they waited to APEC because they didn't want to have any nastiness before APEC when they were hosting in Beijing, and then they cleared them out. And I don't think we're going to hear very much politically from Hong Kong this coming year.
Yes, sir, in the third row here.
Yes.
Wait, if you can wait for the microphone. So.
Stuart Eisler here. What is the end game with Russia and the West and the United States? The end game.
Wow, that's a thesis.
Yeah.
Well, if I could just quote Henry Kissinger saying that in the hundreds of years of history in dealing with Russia, when they're backed in a corner, it never turns out well. And he has said, if that's your plan, maybe you should go to plan B. So I don't know what plan B is ultimately, but I think an end game has to include somehow providing some other paths out of this.
Oh, you actually want plan B? We don't have plan B. Does anybody have plan B?
You want plan B? I'll try to give you plan B. I don't think plan B is going to happen, but what plan B...
It's not going to happen.
Kissinger is right about this. I disagree with Kissinger on most China things because China's changed a lot since he was Secretary of State. Russia, I tend to agree with them because Russia's today a lot like it was when he was Secretary of State, and he understands Putin. And Ukraine needs to be a buffer state. That means they can't join the European Union with an association agreement. That needs to be backed off. And if that isn't backed off, you're going to continue to have problems. I'm not saying it's right, but we do lots of things that aren't right. This is a question of, so far American policy has been successful in punishing the Russians, and if that's what you want to do, great. It has been very unsuccessful in helping any Ukrainians. In fact, it's hurt a lot of Ukrainians. And I think the intention of U.S. policy was actually to help the Ukrainians. And if you want to do that, then you have to facilitate making Ukraine into a buffer state. That's what needs to be done. The Americans need to do that with the Europeans. The Europeans are increasingly aligned with that because despite Merkel's problems with Putin, even in Germany, they're saying, we're not growing, we have to stop this. Where in America, we can keep pushing them because, hey, maybe our red line, but we're not getting hurt on this one. So it doesn't affect us very much.
If we can find somebody in the back, to be fair, but while we're doing that, Ruchir Sharma met a couple of years ago with Vladimir Putin, and you had some interesting things to say. In a nutshell, do you want to... You looked into his soul.
No, I asked Bush about that, in fact, like in terms of what did you see when he looked into his soul? And I think the response was sort of similar, which is the fact that, we today sort of think of Putin in a very sort of evil way, right? Because of the way that he's turned out to be. But I think the thing about Putin is the fact that he was a very different leader in 2001, 2002. We sort of forget that, in that he truly wanted Russia to be part of Europe. He really wanted to sort of integrate Russia with Europe, and his vision was very different in terms of it. And this is, very simple rule that I've developed after all these things is that when a leader is in power for more than 8 to 9 years, bad ththings happen for that country. This is just
So
a
the
good
second year is bad, and then the 8 and 9 year.
No, I'm saying that in terms of no. But I didn't say,
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't say second year is bad. I said second year is a judgment here. In terms of it could be good or bad. But if they're in power for more than a decade, bad things happen to even the best of leaders. There's some exceptions with Lee Kuan Yew, but generally bad too. But very briefly on Putin was the fact that this was late 2010, and I was going to Moscow for a conference. His office knew that I was coming, and they asked me that, will you make a frank presentation on Russia to him at this conference? He's going to be there and stuff. I said, fine, what the hell, I'll do it. But I took the word frank rather seriously. I'm an investor, sort of known to speak my mind. And so like I went up there basically and made a very frank presentation about how good things were in Russia in his first term and how things have deteriorated now. Like in the last 2 or 3 years, I referred to it in terms of what had happened to their economy. There are no small to medium-sized enterprises out there. There's no manufacturing. It's still very oil dependent. I mean, I didn't even use the word corruption, but I used all these other sort of statistics out there. And this is like typical Putin. He was sitting there, he was taking notes down and stuff like that. And later on, he spoke to me, and in his speech also, he referred to it after that in terms of like some positive ways of twisting it. And I thought this had gone all just fine, and I was quite happy. Next morning, I was woken up by my investment bankers saying that, what have you done? I'm like, what have I done? And their entire point was that, haven't you read the press? I said, no, I don't read Russian. And their point was that, the entire press is basically after you for having come here, because this was telecast live. That you've come here, you've spoiled the party, and and the arrogance was, who needs your money? Because oil was at $100, and these guys' budget was balancing at $80. They were just accumulating oil, and the arrogance was, who needs your money and stuff like that. And it was pretty. And I went back to the conference the next day. I had a very cold reception from the organizers. I left Moscow that evening. I've not gone back since.
Good move. Okay, do we have somebody in the back with a microphone? Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoever He
That's great.
Chung is pointing to. Yes.
John McAuliffe from the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. First, since it's now my major effort, I think Ian is too pessimistic on Cuba. I think the Menendez-Rubio wing is simply making as much noise as it can, but the president has got this one solid, so we'll see. I want to go to the South China Sea a bit more and ask, I couldn't get a sense, and you sort of passed by it, what the risk level is that you see. I mean, and then I got a little confused also by this land route, how that affects some of the questions about the South China Sea. But I know in conversations with the Vietnamese that this issue of the sudden territorial accretion, the creation of land, is not taken lightly as a problem for the region, and are you saying this is not really a problem, or could you clarify your sense of where that's going in the next year?
And I should say, if those of you who don't know, John is a big expert and frequent visitor to Vietnam. But Ian, do you want to take that up, or
I'll take
amplify
Cuba
that?
at least. I'll say that I would love to see this work. It's a big win as it occurs. I certainly think you can move on diplomatic relations and opening an embassy, but I will also tell you that as of this morning, Kerry's private perspective is we have a serious problem in Congress. And so I do not, much as it would be nice if it's going to sail through, I don't think this is just noise and smoke from Menendez and friends.
Okay, but on the South China Sea, I mean, we have and it isn't just the Vietnamese, the Philippines, the consistent complaint you hear is, I don't know exactly how John referred to it, but this creeping accretion, or whatever you want to call it, of Chinese advances there that show no, and you talk about, Americans and others just saying we're concerned. This seems to be the classic example of that.
Well, I mean, Josette raised the Vietnam point, and I think that's the right country to focus on, because precisely Vietnam is not an ally of the United States, though there has been a lot of military exercises jointly and the rest. Here, India's been interesting, right? I mean, they've come in, and you've seen meetings between Modi and the Vietnamese, and you've also seen a willingness to say, hey, we're willing to play in your yard. We'll sell you a whole bunch of patrol boats, and which you can use to defend against these Chinese fishing vessels. I mean, you never saw the Indians do stuff like this before. That's and they've got something in return. They want access to the energy in Vietnam on the upstream side. But I think if you're China, I think that Modi has suddenly become an important balancer in the region. He's a huge friend to Abe. He wants to play not just a economic role, but a geopolitical role. His private conversations with Abe are very much about how is it that you, Japan, have developed such a constructive economic relationship with China, given that they are such an adversary of yours.
Right.
And that's precisely the way India understands China. And I think that if you are in the South China Sea right now, you see that the Chinese don't want huge problems and that you have plenty of countries you can hedge with, which was not as true a couple of years ago. But having said that, the point is absolutely right. The Chinese are spending huge amounts on defense. It's a very significant naval spend. It's not a very significant overland spend. And clearly, every single month, they're going to get stronger and stronger on their 9-dash line. And when anyone that looks at the map sees that the 9-dash line is only workable because they believe they have the power projection to enforce it, not because it makes any sense whatsoever. But having said that, over time, do I think they'll be able to enforce it? Of course they do.
Yeah. I want to make, one point here, which is that what I find really fascinating here, at least from my perspective, is that some of these countries like Vietnam and like another very interesting country in the region, although it's rather small, is Sri Lanka, that what these countries really, I think, are doing and need to do is to play off these powers against each other and benefit. And I saw the classic example of that in Sri Lanka. If you go to Sri Lanka, you'll figure out that the Chinese investment there is all over the place. And just how they're playing, each other off, was evident in Sri Lanka. I went to Sri Lanka, I met the president there last year. And this was in the midst of this entire sort of currency crisis, volatility. And I told him that, how are you dealing with it given the fact that you have a large current account deficit? He looked at me, winked, and said, we got China. Right? So, and then he figured out that I'm from India. And very quickly he said, no, hang on, I like India too. And then he goes but Indians are like my relatives. Chinese are like my friends, and friends are better than relatives. So I found it pretty smart that, I think, and that's exactly what, Vietnam, I think what these countries need to do in the region, which they are doing, is playing off these powers against each other and benefiting from that, I think. And I think so therefore I feel, optimistic about some of these countries in the region because I think they're in a geographical sweet spot.
It's all a bit of a dangerous game. It really is. Trillions of dollars of trade go through the South China Sea. The energy supplies for Japan, Korea, and elsewhere. It's deeply serious, and the stakes are very high. And, I don't want to be an alarmist or a pessimist, but if you look at what triggered World War I and all these insecurities, 6 months before the war started and 30 years of bloodshed followed it, there were editorials in Europe saying it's the end of war. We're so interconnected, our economies are so interwoven, we're so globalized, there'll never be war again because there's no reason to, the stakes are too interwoven. The Chinese press has been using the same kind of language as back when there was the invasion of Vietnam in the 70s, of saying, Vietnam has to learn a lesson. China has real legitimate concerns about the trade flows within the South China Sea. The other countries all have very legitimate concerns. There's more than 6 claimants to, this space in here. And the issue in the world, you look at the United Nations, it's very preoccupied with failed states. It's not doing anything on these fronts. Where do you actually bring countries together to work these things through? And where is the leadership to say, wait a minute, it can't just be a war in the media and the press and a statement here and a flight there and leaders saying this. This is the heart. If the South China Sea went wrong, you'd see a global recession so fast. And so there's enough noise around this that, I just think we have to figure out better ways to try to get ahead of these issues. The U.S. has taken a position that, however the claimants work this out, we have a stake, Indonesia has a stake, others outside of it, but we just don't want it done with force. I think the Philippines has a very good request, which is exactly what is China claiming, because we don't even know that. But again, there's no fora for this to happen, and it's one of the areas we're not doing well as a global community in handling.
But maybe we at the Asia Society can do, right? Okay, there's so many hands, we're going to have time for one. Oh my goodness, I don't think I've called on a woman, so if I may call on you.
Sandra Stein.
If you can hang on 1 second, Sandra, just for the mic.
Sandra Stein, really kind of for Ann. about Syria and ISIS and what we're doing, what should we be doing or not doing?
Well, I mean, look, what we should be doing for the Syrian people is very different than what we should be doing from the perspective of the United States electorate, right? This is the problem, is that Obama, following his domestic political mandate, which is what he was elected to do, the desire to stay out of Syria, I think, is pretty high. I mean, you know, after he got himself caught in this red line, he did everything possible to avoid it. That was very unartfully handled, but the ultimate outcome kept the Americans out, which is, I mean, most Democrats and even most Republicans were pretty much okay with that. Despite Hillary's mild protestations more recently, she wasn't a big enthusiast for let's bomb Syria at the time, or let's provide weapons to the rebels at the time. She floated it. That's different from saying, I wanted to do this. I actually think on Syria, the right thing for the United States to do is to lead by example. It kind of kills me that the Swedes have taken the global lead on allowing in Syrian immigrants. Kind of kills me. I mean, we have a Statue of Liberty, right? I mean, our country has been built on talented immigrants from all over the world. Half of Syria has been displaced, 11 million people. Why are we not doing vastly more than the Swedes in bringing these refugees into America and providing them with opportunities and integrating them into our society? And why are we not then using that moral pulpit to get other countries to do the same? I think this is an abdication of American values globally, frankly, and that's a place where we could do it, we could do right, and we wouldn't have to be engaged in a war that, frankly, there are no sides that are credible, that we actually wish to lash ourselves to, and that is appropriate in my view.
Could I add one more low bar thing to be done here? These refugees, many, we've seen the pictures, women, children, families, whole families displaced, whole villages of kids missing education, food, housing, shelter, blankets, all, you know, everything. My old organization, the World Food Program, which I headed up, had to cut off food supplies to the refugees last month because there isn't even a donation of enough money being contributed to make sure people have food and blankets and shelter. This is the easy part. You have humanitarians willing to go and make sure that people have these basic needs met, and even that children don't fully miss an education. And I just want to use this moment to really appeal. And if you look at the amount of funding needed, it's not that much. But again, it's the easy part. So some of the things that could be done that are different than solving the whole geopolitical problem aren't even being done. And I don't really understand that because these are pretty easy things to be done. Hard for the humanitarians, but you've got people willing to go in there and make sure people can at least stay alive.
Okay, on that point, we do have to close it. I want to say one thing before we thank our panel. I want to say some words of thanks, since this is the last of these programs in the current affairs space for the year. Thank you, James and John and Yoshia and Hee Chung and Eric and Oscar. And there's a lot of people wandering around here and some who are not here tonight. And I've left some out, but thanks to the team here at Asia Society who makes this so easy for the rest of us. And then you guys have put so much on the table for us to think of. I'd love to do this again in a year's time, and and then you can stand here with a thing and see how your predictions went. And sorry for those who didn't get their questions in, but a round of applause, please, for a great group.